Hello guys, how's it going? My name is Dal. MoP Classic is dropping oh so soon with the pre-patch and the official release right around the corner. I've been spending a little bit more time with MoP Classic over on the beta, and I've even done a couple of videos primarily highlighting some of the strongest and the most fun classes that most players will recommend you to pick up for this next Classic expansion. However, it looks like that class meta is about to crater as they're making some wild changes and even adjustments for classes for Mists of Pandaria going forward, reverting some of the final patch class adjustments and even bringing in some of the quality of life improvements from Warlords of Draenor early into Pandaria, which is looking like it's going to be one of the biggest meta shifts for this expansion. So if you already thought you had a class locked in as to what you're going to be maining for MoP Classic, you may want to reconsider. And I want to go over exactly every single one of those major class changes that's going to be applying for Pandaria Classic. This is going to be a pretty long video though, so I do want to dive into it as soon as possible. This is why I'll have chapter marks down below so you can skip over into the most relevant section as soon as possible. And with that, if you do want to see more regular World of Warcraft updates in the future, be sure to follow the channel and subscribe, but otherwise, let's dive right in. So as part of the changes, I'm going to go over them in alphabetical order, and I'll try to be as brief as I can with some of the more simple changes, and then so I can just spend more time on some of the more complex ones. For Druids, it's all very straightforward. For balanced Druids in particular, you're actually gaining quite a bit of extra value while in Moonkin form. Normally, Moonkin form increases your nature and arcane damage by 10%. They're just upping it to 20, just a raw damage increase for balanced Druids going forward, which seems quite massive. Also, the passive towards the back, shooting stars, will actually no longer have its chance to proc split amongst multiple targets. This only applies for PvP, which makes it a little bit better for just pure single target or lower target counts for PvP content. But in AoE content, the more targets you have dotted, the more chances you have to reset your Star Surge proc and make it instacast, which should be a fairly solid and noticeable damage gain. And if I got how Mists of Pandaria Classic, you have to actually, you can't just easily switch over to different specs, take a look at them. You'll need to visit a trainer in order to adjust them pretty regularly. So that is something I'll likely have to do here for the video. As for the spec of Feral Druids, they gain the ability of Nature Swiftness, which normally would be something available for balance or restoration, but Feral also gains it. This is kind of huge in some cases, as it can be used to land immediate CC if you need it, or better yet, to get an instant cast B-res whenever you want it. On a minute cooldown, this gives you quite a bit of extra versatility, though this button will not be available for PvP content, so dungeons or raids, Feral stocks go up there definitely. And I'm so retail brained, I completely forgot that you actually have to go to a trainer to change in your class spec, so I'm gonna be hanging out in Moonglade for a little bit of time as a swap around for Guardian and Resto. For Guardian, however, the change is very simple. All that took is the ability of Maul and slightly reduce its energy cost or rage cost from 30 down to 20. And for Restoration Druids, their passive change is also even more simple than Bear Druids, as their talent of, or I guess a passive of Naturalist, which simply increases just all healing you do by a certain amount, used to be 10%, they just amped it by 5% specifically. Like, this is your class aura that increases your overall healing, so there's just a new buff that makes Restoration Druids slightly better heading into Mists of Pandaria. The next change comes to the spec of Fire Mage specifically, primarily dealing with the Fire Mage's combustion, as they're amping it quite a bit. So normally when Fire Mages, as you're in combat situations, as you deal damage to a target, the more damage you deal, the greater ignite you can build against that target. And the harder your spells hit, the harder that ignite can hit. And the idea is you want to ramp up that ignite as best as possible. And then you want to use the ability of Combustion to convert that ignite into a more powerful dot. Now, Combustion deals immediate damage and consumes ignite, but it only consumes a portion of its damage. Normally it would consume like a very small amount, like 20%, but now they're increasing it so it'll actually deal additional damage equal to 50% of ignite damage per tick over 10 seconds. So it basically just means Combustion gains even more value from your ignites, which is just more damage, not something that will be applicable for PvP, however. The next class on the list will be Monks, primarily focusing on Mistweaver, but also some nice new changes for Windwalker. With it being the shiny new class of the Classic expansion, there's a lot of players that are excited to dive into this early iteration of Monks specifically, though some players are already seeing some problems with it, and they're trying to curtail those problems pretty early on. First things first, for Mistweaver, they are adjusting some aspects of the playstyle in general. With passives such as Teachings of the Monastery not granting Crackling Giant Lightning nearly as much of a damage amp. Actually used to be 100% damage increase, now it's currently right now it's down to only a 25% damage increase, unfortunately. Although the ability of Mana Tea is now going to grant you just slightly more mana, recharging it by 5% per stack instead of 4%, so that's pretty solid. Surging Mist mana cost is now being lowered by 13%, and the talent of Rushing Jadewind will now be cancelled when you shift your stances. This is something that they're really looking to avoid for the most part, with having to have monks stance shift in order, or stance dance in order to even activate Russian Jadewind. Many players find this ability generally very mana costly. However, if you were to, let's say, switch over to the ability, and now you get access to a Russian Jadewind, when you switch over to the other stance, you have two stances as a monk. One, the healing stance of the Wise Serpent, then the stance of the Fierce Tiger that increases your damage. It also changes your resources, your primary resource. In the healing stance, you use mana as your primary resource. In Fierce Tiger, you use energy instead. However, this also alters some of those abilities like Russian Jadewind, which no longer costs mana, now it costs energy. So players were switching to the combat stance, activating Russian Jadewind, switching over to the healing stance to continue the wind. So you had to make a macro in order to shift form, activate the wind, shift back into healer, just so you didn't have to spend the mana on that heal. So they tried to curtail this a little bit by making it so that Russian Jadewind does not persist when you shift stances, but also they're going to reduce the mana cost of many of the Mystery of Monks abilities in order to make sure that this class, this spec, does not have any mana issues going forward. With this, they reduce the mana cost of certain abilities such as Jab, your basic chi generator, but also your basic combat ability. Also has had its mana cost reduced by 25%, a partial 5.2 revert. The healing of Enveloping Mist also got buffed up by 48%, which is a fairly sizable change. Also, the healing of Emotes is being increased by 68%, which is a WoD change. Emotes being your damage to healing conversion, like as you deal damage to enemies, your healing ends up, or that damage ends up healing a nearby ally. So it basically increases the effectiveness of your fist weaving playstyle specifically. But also the ability of Revival's healing is also being buffed up by 43%, which should hopefully make Mistweavers pretty competitive going forward with these large changes. Another spec that's buffed up is Windwalker, specifically in how their Mastery of Bottled Fury and Tiger Eye Brew functions, to try to make it a little bit more consistent. And Tiger Eye Brew is actually a pretty important mechanic for Windwalkers in Mists of Pandaria. It is basically your primary mechanic of how you deal damage, which has a bit of a delay to it, but it was a very, very core and a powerful mechanic back then. They changed the actual Mastery of Bottled Fury for PvE content to increase the damage of Tiger's Eye Brew by a certain amount, 0.2% per mastery point. Previously, Mastery would increase your chances to gain an extra stack, but now Mastery just directly increases the effectiveness of Tiger's Eye Brew. And the way that Tiger's Eye Brew works right now is every 3 chi you consume, you get to brew up a stack of Tiger's Eye Brew. This used to be 4 chi with a chance for you to potentially increase the amount of stacks you get, but now it's going to cook up a little bit more consistently. You will still only consume 10 stacks of Tiger's Eye Brew at once, though you can store up to 20 of them, and when you consume all 10, you can increase your damage based on your mastery. For my character, it's at least 58% damage increase when you consume all 10 at once. So they're just trying to make this ability more consistent, but it is going to be a pretty cool ramp-up mechanic for any of you that maybe played a recent iteration of Windwalker, but always wanted to see how the original version of Mists of Pandaria is going to play. However, even then, you're not really getting the original version of Windwalker, but a slightly modified one that is hopefully it's going to feel a little bit better overall to pick up. And from there, we have the class of Paladin, which is getting buffed up all across the board, starting with the spec of Retribution. For Retribution, we have a number of abilities that are just getting a tune-up completely, just all across the entire class kit. Abilities like Divine Storm, Crusader Strike, Judgment, Hammer of the Righteous, Hammer of Wrath, and Exorcism all have had their damage raised by 10%, which is just a flat new buff for Retribution for Pandaria. Also, the ability of Templar's Verdict, your main holy power, damage spender, that damage has also been increased by 20%, so overall this seems like a fairly sizable adjustment for Retribution's overall in terms of their very base class kit and class damage for this classic expansion. From there, we have the spec of Protection, and the damage reduction from Sanctuary, which is the Protection Paladin passive. That damage reduction is now being increased to 20%, which is a new buff that isn't a Warlord's General or a Pandaria Revert. It's just a brand new buff that is granted for Protection Paladins. I think as they're hopefully trying to make tanks a little bit more even, especially when it comes to Blood Death Knights and Brewmasters, and as how popular as all of them were. Also, the protection version of the Sacred Shield ability, that shield absorb effect has been increased by 43%, I think to try to give them just a little bit better overall value, at least in comparison to things like Selfless Healer as well as Eternal Flame. And after the brief reset, we also got the spec of Holy, which Holy got a number of changes. Some are nerfs, but some are buffs in general. First, you have a talent of Eternal Flame. They're actually reducing the periodic healing of this ability by 28%, which seems like a nerf at first. However, it does now interact with the mastery of Illuminated Healing, and Holy's mastery in Pandaria was something that always had some potential, but the spec was not really ever able to hold a candle next to Disc Priest, which we'll talk about those in a second. But the Illuminated Healing allows the healing spells to also place an Absorb Shield on a target for a portion of the amount healed, which gives you some damage protection. And with that ability giving you constant ticking healing, a portion of all that ticking healing is now going to accumulate into Illuminated Healing, so now it has a better interaction with your overall mastery. Also, Illuminated Healing's base value is being raised by 12% as a part of 5.3 Reaver, so it's overall just a fairly noticeable increase for Holy Paladins, in particular for all of Mists of Pandaria. Not only that, but they're also buffing the Holy version of Seal of Insight, which now has a chance to restore 4% of the Holy Paladin's base mana when striking targets, which is a 5.4 revert, which hopefully means it will just generate a little bit more mana throughout an entire encounter. Also, Devotion Aura, which is available for all Paladins in Mists of Pandaria, is being changed for Holy in particular, which now reduces all damage of everybody around you within 40 yards by 20%. Previously, this was really good against magic damage only, but now reduces all damage taken in general. Which means that overall, Holy Paladin's viability as a meta class or a good pick going forward for Mists of Pandaria has gone significantly up. However, not only is Holy, as well as the rest of Druids, are getting buffed up, as well as a couple other healers here and there, but some of the best healers in the game are also receiving a bit of a nerf, which is perfect as we move on to the class of Priest. And speaking of the class of Priest, this was definitely one of the stronger classes out there for a good portion of Pandaria, especially with how good Disc Priest was. However, it seems like they're trying to scale back some of the Disc Priest dominance. First, we have some talent changes that will affect all three specs fairly equally. We have ourselves the talents of the Cascade, Divine Star, and Halo. Now, all of these, or at least rather Halo and Divine Star, will respect a 20 target cap, and focusing on at least healing 6 nearby targets if there's enough friendly targets around you. So there's going to be a little bit more of this like target change. This is mostly a Warlock's general adjustment more than anything. Cascade has had its times that it can bounce lower down just slightly. I think just try to make this ability less insane for the content that it was really good in, which is mad AoE and dungeon content specifically. From there though, we got a few changes, some for Shadow, most of them for Disc, and a huge bulk of them for Holy in particular, I think, to counter the discipline changes. So we're gonna go over the quick ones first with Shadow. For Shadow Orbs will now be something that you'll be able to generate out of combat passively, so hopefully by the time you get into an encounter, you'll be at least filled with a few of these Shadow Orbs so you can have a proper opener instead of having to ramp up for your damage. So that's going to be a nice little bonus. Shadow Form's damage bonus is also being raised to 30% instead of 25%, so it's just a raw Shadow damage increase for Shadow in particular, which will hopefully make him a little bit better going forward. From there, we can move on to some of the changes to Discipline in particular, because this spec is seeing a few nerfs, unfortunately. If you're someone who's excited to play Disc Priest, they were generally one of the best healers out there for Pandaria, but their dominance was so high above so many other classes, it just made playing anything else kind of less good, especially if you were competitive. So it was looking like Disc Priest and Resto were going to be the go-to options, but I think they're trying to change that a little bit. With passives such as Divine Ages now being lowered to 80% of a heal's value instead of 100%. This stays the same for PvP, but for PvE content, the shielding does become a little bit less good when you land those crits. The Healing of Atonement has also gone down by a decent bit. Used to be 90%, now down to 70%, which is more of a Warlord or genre specific change that's being applied a little bit early. The healing from talents like Divine Star, which synergize really well with the Disc kit in general, that is being lowered by 25%, which is yet another WOD change that comes to bite them. However, at the very least, they're increasing the duration of Spirit Shell, giving it a 15-second duration rather than a 10-second duration to apply all of your absorbs to your targets. However, while Disc and Shadow are getting some changes, with Disc primarily getting nerfed, Holy is actually receiving quite a sizable number of buffs. Some of these buffs right now are a work in progress and may not stick all the way through Mists of Pandaria, but they are trying to make this spec just a little bit better, primarily when it comes to some of the holy words. And the way the holy words work for these spec is you actually have to change it to different chakras in order to enable the different abilities that come with some of those words. First one being the holy word Serenity, which is a single target instant heal. The actual healing of this effect is being buffed up by 40%, which is quite sizable, but it also has the additional effect of increasing the critical effects on a target with your healing spells for 6 seconds, increasing that critical effect chance by 25%, so that's fairly solid altogether. When you switch over to the chakra of Serenity, or rather Sanctuary, you get the holy word of Sanctuary, and the healing of this AoE holy word is being buffed by 60%, but they're also cutting the cost of its mana by 33% to try to give them just a little bit bigger of an oomph when it comes to their AoE rate healing. They're also experimenting with the mastery of Echoing Light a little bit, by essentially making it so that Echoing Light now deals its healing every 1 second instead of every 3 seconds. This is primarily a limitation placed back in Pandaria, mostly due to performance-based encounters, because if you have way too many numbers going out, the game would actually tank in performance, so they will reduce the healing back then to 3 seconds. They're switching it back to 1, which should make the ability and the master itself a lot more responsive, and therefore should provide quite a bit more healing output for Holy in general. Also, Holy's big AoE heal of Divine Hymn on a 3-minute cooldown is getting buffed up as well. It will now heal up to 50 targets regardless of raid size. This is on purpose because sometimes pets can actually soak up Divine Hymn, and when you have, let's say, a fairly small target cap for this ability, some of those pets and extra NPCs and extra targets that can be healed can sometimes soak it instead of having it hit healers, or players rather. So Divine Hymn with this change should always hit enough players in a raid at all times, plus any other pets or any other summons that players may have out in the open. So for the most part, it does seem like Holy is getting some sizable buffs, and hopefully it'll become a little bit more competitive and a viable alternative way to the dominance that was Disc Priest of Pandaria. Another class that's going through a few changes is the Rogue, specifically with changes focusing on the spec of combat. Now with combat, what they're doing is actually a bit of a buff, but also a bit of a nerf, which kind of combines together to be an overall gain, by adjusting the way that the ability of Sinister Strike works. First things first, they're reducing the cost of Sinister Strike down to 40 energy instead of 50. So it makes it a little bit easier for you to spam the ability against the target, so you can get a bunch of rapid Sinister Strikes off in quick succession. However, they're also nerfing the damage of Sinister Strike from to 40% of your weapon damage down to 195. So technically, Sinister Strike is now going to do a little bit less overall damage, but what this does allow you to do is to cycle through Bandit's Guile even quicker. And they also now have a nice little counter to telling you how many Sinister Strikes you've used so far, just so you have an idea that you're getting close to like a red buff of Shallow Insight for 10% more damage, or possibly even a yellow buff for 20% more damage. And this way, this change to Sinister Strike allows you to spam the ability a lot more regularly, so you can get more of those Sinister Strikes to push you into that deep red insight, which increases your damage by 30%. So while Sinister Strikes themselves, the damage of the ability is going to be lower and weaker in return, but you get to cycle into that red buff a lot more regularly, which is where most of your damage will come from as a combat rogue. And the last change for rogues is going to be to the spec of Assassination, specifically to the passive of Assassin's Resolve, which requires you to wield daggers in both of your hands. So this passive is now going to increase your Assassin's Resolve damage to 25%, up from 20. So a little buff for Assassination specifically, just in its raw overall damage. From there, we have some adjustments to the class of Shaman, specifically targeting Restoration quite a decent bit. Rest of Shamans were renowned to be one of the strongest, if not the king of healing when it comes to Mists of Pandaria, at least for many players out there. However, it looks like that may not be the case anymore, as they're doing some meta shifts to try to bring down the effectiveness of Restoration for Pandaria, specifically to give other healers a bit more room to grow. Now, a number of ability changes that has been made, one of them being Healing Rain, which back in Pandaria was an ability that you could use as any Shaman spec, as enhancement, elemental, and even restoration. Now, the healing of Healing Rain is being lowered by raw 25%. So this is just a new little nerf that affects every single spec in the game. Then there's a number of talent changes specifically affecting healing and Healing Rain, like the talent of Conductivity. When you cast certain abilities like offensive abilities or healing abilities, you extend the duration of Healing Rain, and this would initially extend up to 40 seconds. They're lowering the max duration of Healing Rain down to 30 seconds, so you won't be able to have a Healing Rain out for 40 seconds throughout an encounter or anything like that. This is a new nerf that's being applied for all 3 specs of Shaman. Also, Ancestral Guidance healing to damage conversions have all been normalized and made a lot weaker, which is more of its Warlords of Draenor era adjustment, where Ancestral Guidance is now going to convert 20% of damage or healing into the other, which is a little bit unfortunate as it had some crazy good scaling for damage to healing and healing to damage, but now both numbers have been toned down by a solid bit, which is overall quite a decent bit of a nerf for restoration going forward. For spells like Elemental Shaman, they are buffing them by a little bit. Lightning Bolt for Elemental is going to deal 10% more damage, so nothing crazy, but a slight little adjustment regardless. For enhancement, they're actually taking the ability of Storm Strike and are buffing it by a little bit, raising its weapon damage scaling to 450% down, which was originally kind of low at 380. This is more of a 5.4 patch revert more than anything. However, for restoration, we are seeing some additional nerfs on top of it, like the AoE healing of Chain Heal is now going to be reduced. This change does not affect PvP content whatsoever, but for Chain Heal for restoration within PvE, like raids and dungeons, there's now going to be a 20% fall off per target of Chain Heal. So every time it jumps to a new target, the healing is going to be a little bit less and a little bit less, where previously it didn't have any fall off whatsoever. So this is yet another way to curb some of that AoE healing of Restoration Shaman. Also, the mana cost of Riptide is being increased by 15%, so you won't be able to spread as many Riptides as you could before, or at least not as effectively, as it is going to be a bit more of a strain on your overall mana, which is yet another way that they're trying to curtail some of the dominance that Restoration famously had for Mists of Pandaria, which is overall quite a bit of a nerf, but it does give other healers a little bit more room to be a little bit more competitive as they're getting side buffs together with the nerfs for Disc and Resto. This is likely going to make some changes in the overall meta shift and the viability of certain classes for PvE content. From there, we have the class of Warlock though, and Affliction and Demonology are both being buffed up quite a decent bit going forward. For Affliction, it's primarily going to deal with some of their filler damage and abilities, and they're trying to make those a little bit better. Primarily Malefic Grasp, but the damage of this ability is being buffed up by 50%, which on its own, the ability isn't all that strong, but the extra effect that it has does make it a little bit better. Malefic Grasp kind of shares at the target doing channeled damage, but it also causes your dots to instantly deal an additional tick of the periodic damage instantly on that target. That initial dot periodic damage is being raised to 50% instead of the original 30. So not only is the ability going to be a bit more channeled, but that channeled sustained damage also going to be quite a bit more effective. Also, that is being applied for Drained Soul as well. Drained Soul base damage is being buffed up by 50%, but it also is going to cause those dots to have an additional damage in effect, same way as Malefic Grasp, but now at 100% value, so as it's going to be a little bit better at this whole execute type of gameplay, and it's going to be overall just a little bit stronger as an ability. The other spec that's getting buffed up for Warlock is Demonology, and the first thing they're doing is buffing up Wild Imps, making them a little bit more effective. Your abilities every few seconds have they spawn in an extra imp from the Twisting Nether to fight for you in combat. Like right now I have a buff, and they're buffing up the effectiveness of those imps by quite a decent bit, buffing them by 43%. Now, the imps themselves are not really the strongest hitting ability in the Warlock's kit, but they do a decent bit of damage, and the fun part is you can actually summon quite a lot of them over an encounter, and they're buffing the damage of all those imps by 43%. They also are buffing up the effectiveness of those pets through a specific glyph of the imps, which allows you to immediately summon 5 wild imps instantly from the Twisting Nether, but while this effect lasts, you can just passively swarm imps, and it just gives you a bit of a cooldown that allows you to deal additional damage with all those imps being active. They're raising this number of imps from 4 to 5, and with every one of those imps doing a little bit more damage, that just makes them overall a bit more effective. They're also buffing up the effectiveness of AoE abilities such as Hellfire, as well as Immolation Aura, which you get while Metamorphosis is active. which will hopefully increase your AoE damage, buffing both of those effects by roughly 25%. Another ability that's been buffed up for Demonology is the Chaos Wave, which I believe is a variation of the Hand of Gul'dan ability, but becomes a bit more instant while in Metamorphosis form. And I remember this ability hitting very, very hard back in the day for PvP, so hopefully it should give it quite a bit of an oomph and better impact overall when it comes to how Demo plays in MoP. And the last spec on the list will be Warrior, specifically targeting the spec of Fury, though there is going to be one general change being added for Warriors for Pandaria as well. Berserker stance is a very unique stance that allows you to gain a little bit of rage when you take damage, but also a bit of rage when you deal damage. So it's kind of enabled whenever you're taking high constant damage, you can switch to the stance to take advantage of the extra rage generated. However, in like raids and dungeons, if let's say you're playing with another class with absorbs, since you're not taking damage directly to your health bar, it would actually fail to generate your rage, as absorbs didn't really count as you taking damage since absorb was preventing damage. But they're changing it, so they're making it so that even if you absorb damage or take any type of damage while Berserk stance is active, you always gain rage from this stance. So if there's an effect where you can actually squeeze out a little bit more rage from Berserker, then it becomes a little bit more valuable overall as a warrior to switch to for certain encounters, and makes the ability a bit more, or I guess the stance itself, a bit more consistent. For Fury, they're also buffing him up through the passive of Crazed Berserker, which now increases auto attack damage raised to 15% gain, which I believe was previously 10 or somewhere around that number. But it overall just gives you a little bit more overall damage. Crazed Berserker offhand damage is also being raised to 30% to try to make it overall just a little bit stronger, especially with some of the attacks that would do offhand damage. Also, they're buffing the duration of abilities like Berserker Rage as well as Enrage, which is one of the ways that Fury Warriors can easily dive into Enrage, which is a pretty big mechanic and a component of their overall gameplay, is to stay enraged for as long as possible so you can get more value from your mastery. The duration of both Enrage as well as Berserker's Rage is being buffed up by 33%, it seems, to be basically 8 seconds in duration, which will hopefully help Fury feel pretty good when it comes to maximizing the value of Enrage, especially when you don't have the best gear available from Pandaria, and while you have fairly low haste values, so you can maintain Enrage almost all the time consistently, or at least have high uptime. So this should overall help curtail that a little bit and make the spec play a little bit better overall, allowing you to gain full value out of your Enrage and the main Fury Enrage mechanic. But with that, as always, I want to thank all of you guys so much for watching, and I hope you guys did enjoy the video. If you did enjoy it or found it informative, go ahead and give this video a like. I would very much appreciate it. Also, join our Discord community to keep up with any of the regular WoW updates. Let me know your thoughts in the comments down below. And as always, I'll see all of you guys in the next one.